The studio lights over MSNBC's The Weeknight were so bright you could see the thin sheen of sweat collecting along Michael Steele's hairline. But he kept his polished composure, fingers neatly folded on the desk. The cheerin at the bottom of the screen scrolled, "Trump indictment fallout, who's to blame?" Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She sat across from Steele in a slate-gray blazer, posture straight, her eyes fixed on him with a calm that was almost surgical. Everyone watching at home, and there were plenty, could sense something was about to happen. This wasn't going to be a safe, polite segment. Michael cleared his throat, giving the camera his best practiced half-smile. "Congresswoman Crockett, you've been quick to assign moral failing to Donald Trump and his base, but millions of Americans still see him as a victim of a politically motivated prosecution." He leaned back slightly, trying to look reasonable. "You can't pretend there isn't at least an argument to be made that this is overreach." Jasmine didn't even shift in her seat. "Michael, are you really going to sit here and sell the idea that a man indicted on more counts than some organized crime bosses is the victim?" There was a beat of silence. Steele raised one eyebrow, his voice smooth. "You can't ignore the perception." "I'm not here to coddle perceptions," Jasmine interrupted, her voice quiet but sharpened to a point. "I'm here to talk about facts." She reached for the stack of papers in front of her, flipping one over with deliberate precision. The camera zoomed in, federal court filings, highlighted in yellow. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, tapping the page. "This is a sworn affidavit detailing how Trump personally pressured officials to falsify election results." "That's not perception. That's conspiracy to defraud voters." A ripple of tension went through the studio. Even the floor director stopped adjusting his headset to watch. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but Jasmine didn't give him the space. "And let's be real clear about what you're doing," she said, her tone lower now, almost intimate. "You're counting on the public being too exhausted to care about the difference between feeling and fact." She set the paper down gently, then looked straight into the lens. "But some of us still care. Some of us remember what truth feels like before it's spun and sugar-coated to protect a man who never cared about anyone but himself." The camera shifted to Michael. For the first time, he looked a little less sure of his script. Michael Steele lifted his chin and tried to reclaim his usual calm. He gestured toward Jasmine with the open palm of a man accustomed to deflecting with authority. "Congresswoman, you're very passionate." "That's not passion," Jasmine cut in, her voice precise. "That's exhaustion. Exhaustion from watching people like you come on air, night after night, trying to rebrand a criminal enterprise as a misunderstood movement." A tight hush fell over the set. Even the production assistant standing by the teleprompter stopped moving. Michael's nostrils flared, but he pressed on. "You can have your opinions, but this country is built on the presumption of innocence. And it's also built on accountability," Jasmine snapped, her eyes locked to his. "You don't get to lecture me about presumption when the same man you're defending tried to strip millions of Americans of their vote." She shifted in her chair just enough to lean forward, closing the space between them without touching him. Her tone dropped into something low and level, a voice that didn't need volume to carry power. "Let's talk about your so-called innocence, Michael." She pulled another sheet from her folder and held it up so the camera could catch every word, a list of Trump's indictments and civil judgments. 34 counts in Manhattan, 40 felony counts in Florida. Civil liability for sexual abuse and defamation. "And you're sitting here trying to convince the public this is a misunderstanding?" Michael tried to interject, but Jasmine kept going. Her hand didn't tremble. "You're not here to inform," she said, her voice steady. "You're here to anesthetize. To lull people back into believing this is all just politics as usual. But it's not." She placed the paper down and folded her hands neatly. "This is what happens when corruption is left unchecked so long that decent people start calling it strategy." Michael looked at the host off camera, as if hoping someone would intervene. No one moved. Jasmine's gaze didn't leave him for a second. "I'm not here to watch you sell the same excuses in a shinier package. The director gestured that they had 30 seconds before commercial, but no one dared to break the moment. The seconds before commercial felt like an hour. Michael Steele's jaw flexed as he searched for something, anything, that might soften Jasmine's words. But she didn't blink, and she didn't let up. The host finally cleared his throat to steer the conversation back to a safer zone. "All right, let's pivot slightly." "No," Jasmine said evenly, her gaze never leaving Michael's face. "Let's not pivot. Let's finish." A hush rippled through the control room, the kind of silence producers hate because it's unpredictable and impossible to edit cleanly. Jasmine turned her attention to the camera, speaking directly to the audience at home now. This is why people are disgusted with politics. Because every time the truth gets uncomfortable, someone like Michael tries to pivot. Tries to soften the blow. Tries to pretend the moral line hasn't already been crossed. Michael's lips parted, an objection halfway there. "But you don't get to hide behind euphemisms tonight," Jasmine pressed on, her voice calm but relentless. "You don't get to say, alleged, or complicated, or politically charged to avoid the reality that you're defending a man who tried to steal an election he lost." The host shifted in his chair, clearly regretting ever trying to cut in. "And Michael," Jasmine continued, finally turning her gaze back to him, "you can call it strategy if you want. You can call it partisanship. But history will call it cowardice." Michael swallowed, his throat bobbing visibly. "I'm not defending the behavior. I'm defending the right." "The right to what?" Jasmine's voice cut across his like a scalpel. "To walk away from responsibility? To pretend you didn't see it when it mattered most?" Her hand flattened over the stack of documents in front of her. "Because that's what this is about. Not legal nuance. Not party lines. But the very simple question of whether this country still has the guts to call corruption by its name." A long, tense pause. The director's voice crackled in the earpiece, 10 seconds to break. But in those 10 seconds, Jasmine leaned in one last time, her voice dropping so low it forced Michael to lean closer to hear. "You can keep your rehearsed talking points," she murmured. "I came here with receipts." The screen finally cut to commercial. But no one in the studio moved. When they came back from commercial, the mood was electric, like everyone in the studio had stopped pretending this was just another night of cable news. Michael Steele tried to reclaim the upper hand by softening his tone, the way polished strategists do when they feel the ground shifting. "Congresswoman, let's at least acknowledge that millions of Americans feel unheard, ignored." "Oh, I'm well aware," Jasmine interrupted. Her voice was still level, but her eyes had gone cold. "I'm from Texas. I represent people who feel ignored every single day. But let's be real clear, they feel ignored because their jobs were shipped overseas. Because their wages stagnated while the cost of living doubled. Because politicians like Trump told them they were forgotten, and then spent 4 years proving it." She turned slightly in her chair to face the camera again, her expression hardening. "And when those same politicians get caught with their hands in the cookie jar, you come out here to soothe the public with fairy tales about witch hunts and vendettas." Michael tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Jasmine, you can't deny the optics." "The optics?" Jasmine echoed, tilting her head just enough to make it feel like she was examining him under a microscope. "Michael, the optics are the least of our problems." Her voice grew quieter, forcing everyone to lean in to catch her words. "You know what the real problem is? It's that too many people with your platform are more invested in not offending a corrupt political machine than telling the truth." She picked up one of the papers and held it between 2 fingers, like evidence in a courtroom. "This isn't about optics. This is about a former president who incited violence to cling to power. And the only reason you won't say it plainly is because you're afraid you'll lose the approval of the same audience he radicalized." Michael's jaw tightened. "That's a very convenient accusation." "It's not an accusation," Jasmine replied, her voice low and steady. "It's an observation. And it's backed by every indictment, every sworn deposition, every fact you keep pretending is up for debate. The studio went silent. A producer mouthed wow from behind the camera. Michael shifted in his chair but didn't respond. He couldn't. The quiet after Jasmine spoke felt almost suffocating, like everyone in the building had collectively forgotten to breathe. Michael Steele tapped his pen once against the desk, searching for a way to pivot without looking like he was running. Congresswoman Crockett, I don't think it's fair to suggest I'm defending corruption. My point is. Jasmine didn't flinch. Your point, she said, her voice precise as a scalpel, is that as long as you keep saying it's complicated, you don't have to pick a side. She folded her hands in front of her, her gaze fixed on him. But let me ask you something, Michael, do you think the families of Capitol Police officers who were attacked because of Trump's lies feel it's complicated? Michael's lips parted. He looked like he might try to respond, but Jasmine didn't give him the chance. Do you think the election workers who had their addresses posted online and received death threats feel it's complicated? Her voice was getting softer, not louder, like she was done performing and had settled into something rawer, more real. Do you think the Americans who watched their own neighbors storm the Capitol because they believed a fantasy you're still dignifying with airtime feel it's complicated? Michael swallowed, glancing toward the teleprompter as if hoping for a lifeline. I'm not here to win a debate, Jasmine said, her tone turning almost mournful. I'm here because too many people in power are too cowardly to say the obvious out loud. Donald Trump isn't a victim. He's an architect of the chaos we're still living through. The host tried to step in, voice careful. Maybe we could. No, Jasmine said again, her eyes locked on Michael. You don't get to float above this. You don't get to wring your hands and sigh about polarization while you feed the same narrative that's tearing this country apart. The producer behind the camera gave the wrap-it-up signal, but Jasmine didn't move. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice low enough that it almost didn't make it to the mic. You're worried about optics, she said quietly. I'm worried about truth. And one of us has our priorities backward. Michael looked away. And for a heartbeat, no one spoke. The host exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 10 minutes. All right, he said, voice carefully neutral, let's try to shift gears here. But Jasmine wasn't finished. No, she said again, softly but with that same finality that seemed to freeze the air around her. I'm not going to let this segment end on a polite shrug. Her eyes never left Michael's face. You have a choice tonight. You can keep playing the respectable middleman, pretending this is all a misunderstanding between two equal sides. Or you can admit the truth. Michael's jaw worked as he clenched it, then forced it to relax. Congresswoman, I respect your perspective, but... No, Jasmine interrupted, her voice so low the microphone almost didn't catch it. This isn't about respect. This is about honesty. She reached for the next paper in her folder, an article, the headline bold enough that even viewers watching on small screens could read it. Former president knew of plans to overturn election, sources say. Jasmine laid the paper flat on the desk between them. You see that headline? She asked, her tone almost conversational. That's not an editorial. That's a sworn statement from people who worked in that White House. Michael swallowed. You're a smart man, Jasmine continued. You know what happened. You've known since the day it happened. But you'd rather sit here and split hairs over language than say it out loud. The camera slowly zoomed in on her face, unblinking, resolute. When history writes this chapter, it's not going to care how carefully you parsed your words. It's going to remember who stood up and who sat down. Michael tried to gather himself, taking a slow breath, but Jasmine leaned forward just enough that he had no choice but to meet her eyes. And you, she said, her voice steady and soft, have spent too long sitting down. For a few seconds, the only sound in the studio was the quiet hum of the lights overhead. The host cleared his throat and tried again. We have to. But Jasmine didn't even look away. "Keep running from it if you want," she said calmly. "But the truth isn't going anywhere." When the next break finally came, the control room erupted in whispers and frantic hand signals. Producers were debating whether to keep the segment going or pull the plug before it turned into a full-scale reckoning on live TV. Michael stared at the table, breathing in slow, shallow bursts. He looked like a man trying to calculate the cost of every word he hadn't said. When the red light blinked back on, Jasmine was already sitting straighter, her hands calmly folded over the stack of papers she'd brought. The host spoke first, his voice cautious. "Congresswoman Crockett, some viewers will say you're being disrespectful to your colleague here tonight." Jasmine didn't miss a beat. She turned to the camera, her expression clear and unflinching. "If telling the truth feels disrespectful, that's a reflection of how far we've lowered our standards," she said. "I'm not here to protect anyone's feelings. I'm here because the stakes are too high to pretend anymore." She pivoted to Michael, her voice softening by a fraction. "You don't have to like me. You don't have to agree with me. But you do have to decide if you're going to keep treating democracy like it's an academic exercise." Michael drew in a careful breath. "I understand your passion." "My passion?" Jasmine cut in, one eyebrow arching. "No, Michael. My obligation. To the people who sent me here. To every American who's tired of watching politicians tiptoe around sedition because they're afraid to offend a voter bloc." The host tried to intervene, but Jasmine held up one finger without looking away from Michael. "Let me be clear. You can spend the rest of your career framing this as politics. But it wasn't politics that drove people to break windows and beat officers. It was a lie. One lie repeated 1,000 times by a man you still refuse to name as the cause." Michael shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. But he didn't argue. "And if that makes you uncomfortable," Jasmine finished, her voice a measured hush, "good. Maybe discomfort is exactly what it takes to remember which side of this you're on." A hush fell over the studio again, no scripted question, no tidy transition. Just the raw, unsettling silence that always follows the truth. The host swallowed, visibly thrown off his rhythm. He tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Congresswoman, perhaps we could turn to policy specifics." Jasmine didn't blink. "We'll get to policy. But not before we finish this." She placed both palms on the table and leaned in, her tone deceptively calm. "Michael, you spent years as a Republican National Committee chairman. You know exactly how this machine works. You know how fear gets weaponized. You know how good people are manipulated to believe their neighbors are enemies." Michael opened his mouth, but Jasmine kept going, her words deliberate and clean as a scalpel. "You know the playbook because you helped write it." The host went pale. A producer near the camera covered his mouth with one hand. Michael's face flushed. "That's a cheap shot," he said finally, voice strained. "No," Jasmine said, her tone soft but unyielding. "A cheap shot is what you've been taking at every Democrat who tries to hold this country together while your former colleagues burn it down." She lifted her hand to indicate the stacks of evidence in front of her, indictments, reports, sworn testimonies. "I'm not here to sanitize this for television. I'm here because the people who elected me deserve to see someone who won't pretend that complicity is neutrality." Michael didn't look at her this time. He stared somewhere off camera, his jaw working as he tried, and failed, to find a response that wouldn't sound hollow. "You can spin this however you want," Jasmine continued. "But deep down, you know the truth. You know that if any other president had done what Trump did, you'd be the first one calling it treason." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "And so would I." The host tried again to intervene, his tone tight with anxiety. "We really have to." Jasmine turned to face the camera head-on. "America, you deserve better than excuses. You deserve leaders who call corruption by its name. And you deserve to know that even the people who built this machine can choose to step away from it. Michael finally looked back at her. His face was pale, his expression haunted by something deeper than embarrassment, something closer to recognition. The studio felt smaller now, like the walls themselves were listening. Michael cleared his throat, his voice rough. You think you're the only one who cares about the truth? Jasmine didn't answer right away. She studied him, really studied him, as though trying to decide if he meant it. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but edged in something like sorrow. No, she said quietly. I think you care. I just think you care more about being seen as reasonable than being seen as honest. Michael swallowed, the truth of that landing somewhere behind his eyes. And that, she continued, her voice dropping lower, is how democracies die. Not with bombs or invasions. With polite men in suits who look away when it matters most. The host shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between them. We have to go to a break. Jasmine held up her hand without looking away from Michael. Not yet. Her tone was almost gentle. I don't hate you, Michael. I'm just tired. Tired of watching you, and people like you, lecture the rest of us about civility while you excuse a man who tried to end free elections. Michael started to speak but stopped himself, as though realizing there was no version of this argument he could win without lying to himself. You asked me once why I'm so angry, Jasmine said, her voice softening further. I'm angry because I watched Capitol Police officers cry in hallways. I'm angry because I sat with a mother whose son came home from Afghanistan only to be murdered in D.C. by someone radicalized by election lies. She swallowed. And I'm angry because you know all this, and you still keep pretending there's a both sides here. For a moment, the studio was absolutely still, no shuffling, no coughing, not even the hum of nervous producers. Michael looked down at his notes, his hands motionless. Jasmine leaned back, her expression almost weary. That's why I came here tonight. Not to embarrass you, but to remind everyone watching that the truth doesn't need permission to exist. The red light on the camera stayed lit. And the quiet was the kind that wrapped around the audience at home, making them hold their breath without realizing it. The host exhaled like he'd finally accepted there was no salvaging the usual polite facade. He looked into the camera, searching for a transition that wouldn't sound ridiculous. But Jasmine spoke first, her voice carrying a quiet finality. I'm not here to win an argument, she said. I'm here because millions of Americans watched their democracy nearly get stolen in broad daylight, and were told afterward to calm down. Her gaze swept the studio, then returned to Michael. I won't calm down. Not while the people who helped build this mess keep acting like they had nothing to do with it. Michael pressed his lips together. For the first time, he didn't look defensive. He looked tired. Maybe even ashamed. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't lean back with a satisfied smile. She just breathed in, slow and steady, and continued in that same even tone. I believe in redemption, she said. I believe in second chances. But not while the first chance is still being denied accountability. The host's voice cracked as he tried to cut in. Congresswoman, final thought? She turned toward the camera, her expression clear and resolute. My final thought is simple, she said. Democracy isn't fragile because people are too angry. It's fragile because too many people in power are too comfortable. She let that hang in the air, no soundtrack, no applause, just the raw, unsparing truth. And in living rooms across the country, people who normally switched the channel felt their stomachs tighten. Because whether they agreed with her or not, they knew she wasn't performing. She was testifying. Michael sat silent as the segment finally ended. The host tried to regain composure, thanking the guests in a voice that sounded oddly small. But Jasmine didn't wait for the sign-off. She gathered her papers, gave Michael a single nod, not of triumph but of recognition, and walked calmly out of frame. And that was the moment that would be replayed again and again. Not the argument. Not the heat. But the undeniable clarity. When the lights dimmed and the cameras finally cut, the silence that settled wasn't the awkward kind. It was the kind that follows a reckoning, when everyone in the room has to sit with what they just heard. Jasmine didn't need applause to validate her. She didn't walk out of that studio hoping to trend or to score a clip that would loop on social media. She walked out because her job wasn't to make people comfortable, it was to make them confront the reality they'd been avoiding. In a political world addicted to spin, her words weren't spin at all. They were a reminder. Truth doesn't care about your affiliations. Truth doesn't care about your brand. Truth shows up whether you're ready for it or not. And maybe that's why so many people watching at home felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Not outrage. Not amusement. But the unmistakable ache of recognition. Because in the end, democracy doesn't survive on politeness. It survives on accountability. And Jasmine Crockett was never going to apologize for demanding it.